Hello and welcome to Cyber Focus, your source for international business information. My name is Tim Smith and you're watching our series on sustainable development and human migration. Our guest today is Dr. Frances Trix. Dr. Trix is Professor Emerita with Indiana University's Anthropology, Linguistics, and Near Eastern Languages and Cultures departments. Her expertise as a linguistic anthropologist working with Muslim communities, primarily in the Balkans regions, has given Frances many opportunities to work closely with immigrants, including Muslim immigrant communities in North America, Kosovo and Macedonia, and Balkan Muslim immigrants in Turkey. She has published many books and edited collections, and her latest book is Urban Muslim Migrants in Istanbul: Identity and Trauma Among Balkan Immigrants. In this interview, Frances will draw from her years of research and working with migrant populations to give us her insights on how human migration can be addressed sustainably. Frances, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks. To begin, can you share with us what led you to pursue the topic of forced migration of Muslims from the Balkans?
It's a long-standing project, and it has several roots. One was when I was a graduate student, and I heard a professor speak. He's currently a professor at University of Louisville. He's a demographer, and he'd been actually in the Peace Corps in Turkey, and he talked about Muslims who had been forced out of former Ottoman territories, but he only had numbers. And numbers can be compelling, but they're not compelling in the same way that human stories are. So he talked about 5 million Muslims being forced out. Well, 5 million is a big number when people didn't know that they existed at all. But they're not compelling in the same way life stories are. And that must have just nestled in the back of my mind. But the real impetus for doing this research came actually from a Turkish conversation class when I was still living in Michigan before I came to Indiana. And if you like languages the way I do, languages take practice. It's like exercise. If you don't do it, you lose it. And Turkish is one of my languages. So I had a conversation practice. And one of the people in my conversation group was a former NATO general. Actually a Colonel McLeod. And we were talking in this awful little room in the graduate library of University of Michigan, and Colonel McLeod liked to talk about battles. He was NATO. Any case, a former NATO. And he was talking about the Russo-Turkish War of 1878 battles. And we were sort of listening. But our conversation director finally interrupted, and she said all they had to eat was grass. And it woke us all up. We hadn't been thinking about the people. And these were the refugees from that war. And then I realized I knew nothing about the refugees then. And that got me working on that. And it turned out there were waves of refugees from this. Well, 1878 is quite a while ago. So I looked in the 20th century and found there were 6 waves of forced migration from the Balkans to Turkey. And I thought, I'm going to find out more about this. And I ended up researching the earliest wave of these 6 waves. If you're an anthropologist, you need to work on people you can talk to. And the earliest wave was the earliest wave that had living people was people who had been forced out right after World War II. And that's what I wrote my book on. And they were incredible. It was actually it was a good timing because they had been forced out when I did my research 50, 60 years ago. And people who have been traumatized, you don't want to talk to them immediately afterwards because people have to cope with trauma. But 50 or 60 years later, they want to talk. And the people I talked to wanted to tell me. So the one man whose mother had lost 17 relatives in one night, or the man whose father lost his brother, or people would tell me the last time they closed the door on their house. These are really powerful stories that people never forgot, and that's what I wrote on.
Thank you very much for sharing that with us. In your new book, you raise questions concerning the preservation and articulation of identity amongst the urban Muslim migrant communities. How does this issue of identity impact responses to migration, both within the immigrant communities and in the host country at large?
Well, when somebody's forced out of their home, they lose so much. Potentially they lose things that made their life meaningful. They lose networks, they lose structure of their day, they lose so many things, and they have to go to a new place where they don't know people, where they don't know how they'll support themselves and so forth. So they, in many ways, they feel like they have no identity. If they're refugees, that's what being a refugee is. You have your identity stripped from you. One of the things this group did is something that immigrants have done in America for generations. They had Landsmannschaften, which you, from your knowledge of German, you know, hometown associations. So when these people, these were urban people, forced migrants from the Balkans, when they came to places like Istanbul or cities in Turkey, they made connections with other people from the same hometown. And this way they were able to preserve some of their hometown identity. They had the same dialect. They spoke the same dialect. They knew each other from before. And this helped them preserve a sense of themselves as they were adjusting to the new setting. There were also people in Turkey who had gone there before them. And again, you have shreds of a network that you try to build on. What was particularly helpful for these people, there were two things that were very helpful that allowed them to sustain themselves. One is a lot of the men had been members of guilds. Tradesmen guilds. They had organizational abilities that they were able to transfer from the urban setting in the Balkans to the urban setting in Istanbul. If you have organizational abilities, you certainly know that in the business school, that transfers. And those guild association abilities, they used again in their new association in the new urban setting.
And thankfully, in a small part, that validates their identity
Very
with
much
the
so.
skill that they're able to bring to their new host country.
The other thing that I would add is these were Muslims. Part of that was difficult because modern Turkey, they came from a more conservative background where they had been a minority. Remember, former Yugoslavia was a secular society, and one of the reasons that they were pushed out is that modern Yugoslavia at that point, this is the late 40s, early 50s, was against Muslims. They all had to do military service, and in the past they had had two pots, one with pork and one without pork, but now it all had pork. Well, Muslims don't eat pork. I mean, that matters to Muslims, and they were not allowed to pray. They had to, in any case, it was against their practices. When they went to modern Turkey had secularized in many ways too, and they found that they didn't fit in exactly. They had kind of old school Ottoman Muslim practices, but that actually was a form of organization as well because they had annual holidays. And what they found is that they would keep the annual holidays in their families, and then the second day of the holiday they would all meet as their organization. So that gave a secondary structure. It also gave them dignity because Islam is one of the most generous of religions. Generosity is built in. Feed the poor is built in. So people who didn't have things in Ramadan, the month, you always give to the poor. And there's nothing undignified to receive during Ramadan. So all children must receive a new set of clothing. So they found by building on the religious customs, people could give and receive without feeling embarrassed. And they were able to build on those and at the same time strengthen their community. So both the guild organization and the organization that everyone accepted as appropriate through their religion strengthened their identity and their community.
Thank you, Frances. Thank you very much. I know you've spent a great deal of time conducting research in migration detention centers and refugee camps. What do you think can be done or can be done better to support migrants who are living in these situations, in these places? Do you think this is a sustainable model for dealing with migration?
I observed, as an anthropologist, you become a very good observer. I was in former Yugoslavia in the 1980s and watched Yugoslavia fall apart. That really made me an anthropologist. I went there as a linguist to look at grammatical patterns. And I like grammar. A lot of people don't. I like the order of it. But I'll have to tell you, watching a country fall apart is more interesting than grammar. People talk about terrorist attacks as being scary, but state terrorism is 10 times worse. And the UDBA, the state police in Yugoslavia, were second only to the Stasi. So Americans, I think, are naive. The state police is horrible. It's when somebody comes to the door and you know whoever answers the door won't come back. State terrorism is pretty terrible. So I watched Yugoslavia fall apart. I was there when Milosevic came to power. And I also worked with refugees from Bosnia and from Kosovo. So I was educated in a vicious way. And then I went to Kosovo after the war. That's after the war in 98 and 99. And 10,000 people were killed and 20,000 women and girls were raped. That's really horrendous. I don't think the reality of that sunk into a lot of Americans. It's very hard to communicate that to people here. Maybe I don't want us to have to see that. But I also saw what international aid did. And international aid was very inefficient is the kind word. The people who knew what to do were the people that I respected in international aid were the Scandinavians, who didn't come in with huge pocketbooks, but who left their people there and who actually listened to the locals, women's groups. And then what I wrote on in Turkey was actually an indictment of international aid, because I think international aid should use the people who are there. They know the culture. They know the languages.
Absolutely.
Don't bring in a lot of people who don't know the language, who don't know the religion, and want to make a bundle from it. That's why I think local women's groups can do much better. Local women's groups can talk to all the people. And they're there for the long haul.
Yeah. Frances, thank you. That's all the time we have today, but I appreciate all that you've shared with us. Thank you very much. That's all for this edition of Cyber Focus. Thank you for tuning in. If you have any comments or suggestions for future topics, please let us know at CIBER, that's CIBER, at indiana.edu.